Welcome. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Ann Cadwell, and I'm the Retail Sector Manager for the Canadian Nursery Landscape Association. Just a quick housekeeping item. All microphones are muted, the cameras are off, and if you do have any questions, please put them in the chat section, which is found at the bottom of your screen. Thank you for taking the time to attend our Garden Centre Canada webinar with Dr. Hall. Garden Centre Canada is a commodity group under the CNLA. We specifically focus on retail garden center interests, education, networking, training, and marketing. We connect independent garden centers from coast to coast with the intent on a shared collaboration brings success for all. The sharing of ideas, trials, and tribulations was very evident at our last Garden Center Summit in July 2019 in Mississauga. And this is where many of us first heard Dr. Hall speak. Robin Godfrey, our Garden Centre Canada chair, is now going to take the time to introduce Dr. Hall. Robin?
Thanks, Swan. Hello, everybody. I know we have a little technical problem there at the beginning, but I think we're up to 50 attendees right now. We have 90 booked in. First of all, I'd like to thank everybody for showing up. I'd like to, for those who don't know, we brought Dr. Hall into our summit last year in Toronto. It was a great success. He had a lot of great information, and so we'd like to invite him. We'd like to invite him in again to do this webinar, especially with everything going on with COVID. So first of all, Dr. Hall grew up in the industry on a nursery in Western North Carolina. Although an economist by training, he is currently a professor of the Department of Horticultural Sciences at Texas A&M University, and also a holder of Ellison Chair International Floriculture. His major areas of specialization include innovation, management, marketing strategies, financial analysis, and benchmarking, and the situation/outlook for nursery and greenhouse crops. Throughout COVID-19, he was very active in the speaking daily on the Zoom calls and webinars in the industry associations all around the country from different sectors in the green industry, collecting benchmarking data from growers and the retailers. He is particularly known for his enthusiasm, passion, and intensity of exhibits when speaking. Dr. Hall is an honorary lifetime member of the Texas Nursery and Landscape Association and has received TNLA's award for outstanding service to the nursery industry. He is also a member of the Hall of Fame of honorary lifetime member of the Tennessee Nursery and Landscape Association. Again, I would like to welcome Dr. Hall back to CNLA's event that we had. I'd also like to say going forward, Dr. Hall, even though you are immensely depth in the U.S. economy, you are very well adept to the Canadian economy, which is quite impressive when you're at the summit. So for those out there, hey, we have an American here talking about our industry. You have a total command of our industry as well, which was quite prominent in the last summit you did for us last year. So with that, I'll hand it over to you.
All right. Thank you very much, Robin. I appreciate that introduction. And it's good to be back here with y'all. I mean, I'd rather be in person, but this is kind of the next best thing. I would like to remind everybody that we have a chat box, right? And if you see your chat box, you can open that up and you can see that I've already been chatting with a few folks this morning. And you can pop in your question right there. And I keep the chat box open and I try to monitor that. And if you got any questions, just go ahead and pop right on in and I'll answer those on the fly. But any questions we don't get to during the webinar, and I'll probably speak for, I don't know, approximately 31 minutes and 16 seconds. And but anything I don't get to during the webinar, we'll come back and address after my remarks in the Q&A period. I want to leave plenty of time for Q&A so that we can have a good discussion at the end. All right, so the topic, planning around an uncertain COVID future. And certainly that is the great $64 question is, what is COVID going to do to the future of the green industry? Well, I'm going to try to answer that in a methodical manner. First of all, I'm going to talk about the Canadian COVID situation and the snapshot of the Canadian economy. And then what does recovery look like? And then lastly, what are the implications for the green industry? And as Robin mentioned, I tend to stay up with the Canadian industry in the economy as well as the US because of the linkages between our two industries. And there's significant overlap in terms of market windows and collaborations and strategic alliances and so forth. And so, and of course, a lot of inputs used in both industries, originate from Canada. So, i.e. peat moss. And so there's a great synergy from looking at the two economies simultaneously. But my focus today is going to be mainly on your situation. As I said, there's just a lot of uncertainty. And last year, I actually had this picture on the right, this roadmap, because it depicts all these different intertwined, I think I just made up a word, intermingled roads here. And you don't know exactly where one particular road is going. And so there's a great deal of uncertainty because there's a lot of paths ahead of us. But I accompanied that with the Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. now, now, I did this partially as a joke. And of course, I laugh at my own jokes, Scott. I really can't hear whether you're laughing or not. And that doesn't really matter to me because I like telling the joke. And so I like hearing it. And so there you go. I say it anyway. But the Heisenberg principle is that any particular object, the more you know the position of that object, the less accurately you know the momentum or the speed at which that object is traveling. It doesn't matter whether it's a human, whether it's a bullet, whether it's a plane, whether it's a house, or whatever. Everything in the universe acts as both a particle and a wave. Now, why in the world would I use this Heisenberg principle as an analogy to kick off this thing? Well, it's kind of like the economy. The more you do a deep dive and you look at a particular indicator, the less aware you see of the 10,000 foot view and the direction of movement. And so my particular focus is going to be more from an airplane view rather than being on the trail in the mountains, right? In the trail in the mountains, you can only see so far ahead of you. I want us to take us a little bit higher than that and see if we can't navigate the uncertainty in a manner that gives you a little more certainty about what do you need to do as a green industry business. So if I can accomplish that in 31 minutes, then I'll be successful. All right, now let's look at the COVID situation in Canada. This is data that was current up until September 1st, that you have roughly 130,000 cases of COVID across the country. And of course, you've got 37.56 million people in Canada. And so if you look at the rate at which you are experiencing COVID, it's slightly less than other countries. And the reason is that you guys know how to social distance. You know how to mask. You guys are following the rules more so than folks here in the States because we have a leader that defies the rules. And so everybody thinks it's okay to defy the rules, right? We're anxiously awaiting November to see what happens there so that I better not go down too far down that path. Anyway, my point being is that if you look at the number of cases or you look at deaths, you're getting that under control. Of course, the mainly populated areas of Quebec, Ontario, Alberta, British Columbia, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Nova Scotia, those are the big areas where there's people. So those are the big areas where COVID has been the issue. Well, duh, okay. Well, I applaud you in terms of the ability that you've had in terms of curbing COVID's impact on your country. Now, any chance you can get a recording? Yep. I see the chat there and Ann's already responded that this is being recorded. However, let me also add, you don't have to worry about taking really detailed notes because I'm going to share this PowerPoint, the actual PowerPoint file with Ann. I'm going to share that with Ann. And then perhaps that can be uploaded on the website so that you can download that PowerPoint and use it for however you want to, right? You can cite me, or if you want to. If you don't want to, that's fine. But you'll be able to actually use this PowerPoint file, not a PDF, of the PowerPoint file. It's yours, right? All right, so, yep. And so Ann has already said you want to provide both for the members. That's good. Now, let's talk about how people are feeling there in Canada. There's what's called a media sentiment index. If you go across, and I apologize, my dog barking in the background there. This microphone is a very powerful microphone, so I'm sure it's picking up her barks and everything. And but anybody walks down the road, I know it. Anybody walks up towards my house, I know it. So she's not the brightest dog in the world, but she sure is pretty. She's a golden Pyrenees. And so, but anyway, look at the sentiment regarding COVID right now in terms of the media. And you can see that in social media, there's a lot more negative comments that are going on. And that's to be expected. That's the whole nature of social media. You've seen a lot of positive stuff, a lot of neutral stuff, but a lot more negative. And TV and radio, a little bit negative, but by and large, your sentiment index is such that there's a lot of neutrality. People are waiting to figure out what's going on, in other words. All right. Now, one indicator of your economy that I like is this commercial traffic activity index, right? If you fit a regression line through all these commercial vehicle providers, then you can see that as a trend, it's trending back upward. That's important because goods and services need commercial vehicles to get to the consumer. If that's trending upward, then that's a very good sign, and I'll verify that. Now, you may remember, those of you who have heard me either speak at the Garden Center Summit or at other places in Canada, I've spoke several times. You may recall this particular slide. I brought it back just to show you that in 2020, we were expecting the second quarter would be, there would be a lull in the second quarter, mainly because of the situation of the interest rates and housing and a lot of uncertainty there in terms of the Canadian economy. But we sure didn't expect the second quarter to fall out the way it did. 41% contraction in the Canadian economy in the second quarter. Now you compare that to the US, 33%. Now I want to make sure these data are annualized. You see down here, this is annualized data. Well, what does that mean, Charlie? Well, that means if you take quarter one GDP and then quarter two GDP, and you compare the decrease, like in the States, I think it was a 9.5% decrease from quarter two from quarter one. Well, that's a quarterly type of data. But if you were to take that same decrease in quarter two and you have 4 straight quarters of that for a year, that's what we would have in the States. We would have a 33% decline. And if you take the same decline in GDP in Canada and you take 4 consecutive quarters of that same level of economic performance, it would equal 41%. So again, it pays to know enough to know the difference of what's underlying you'll hear 41% in the media and you'll say, guacamole, that was horrible. Well, it was horrible. However, that's an annualized number. So I'm projecting probably, and I don't remember what quarter one was, so it's going to be a lot less, probably somewhere between probably 11 and 15% decrease of quarter two from quarter one, which again, it's the biggest decreases that either of the two countries have had ever. But I want to make sure that you understand these are annualized data. Now, this quote I pulled, I forgot where I got this quote, but I liked it, and so I grabbed it. Canada's economic recovery continues, albeit at a slower pace. All right, so both US and Canada, we see a V-shaped recovery, but that V doesn't take us all the way back to where we were. It's a partial V, right? And I'll show you the shape of what I'm projecting the recovery to be here in a second. Unemployment rose by only about 245,000 in August, right? The smallest increase since the recovery began in May. So you're creating jobs, but that pace is slowing down. And you've only recovered 1.9 million of the 3 million jobs you lost during COVID. All right. So you got 1.1 million people out there, or jobs, that are still not put back into place. Some of those aren't going to ever be put back into place. That's the thing. And so this sentence at the end, I particularly appreciated. This means that many of the jobs may never come back, and recovery should now look to creating jobs in other segments of the economy with a brighter future. Perhaps some of those brighter future jobs could be in the green industry. All right, we'll talk about that in a minute. Now, the unemployment rate now is still 10.2%. The technical term for that is it sucks. It sucks here in the U.S. as well. Our unemployment rate's roughly the same thing. And, we were at an all-time low, just like you guys were at an all-time low before COVID. And that COVID just put the hammer on us. Now, if we look at some other economic indicators, I talked about unemployment rate, the average number of weekly hours. If you look at the direction of this curve, over here where I got my cursor on the left-hand upper side, average hours of worked per week is only back up to 30.6, right? Now, so that's probably 3 points lower than where you are normally. Retail sales, consumers are holding up their end of the bargain, because you can look at the percentage change month over month, right? And so looking at January through 19 and January of 2020, and then the bottom fell out. And if you look at month over month changes, you can see that there was a 16% increase in what consumers spent in July versus what they spent in June. Again, these are the latest data, so I'm just reporting on that. Existing home sales are also increasing because they also took a big hit. And here's another good indicator: manufacturing shipments over here on the right decrease, but then 21% increase month over month. Those are things that are headed in the right direction. I like that direction of movement. All right, so there's some favorable things going on. But we have not cured COVID. We don't have a vaccine for COVID, in which, by the way, people have been asking me lately, so it may be on some of your minds, how quickly is it going to be before we get a vaccine? Is President Trump right? Are we going to get the vaccine before the election? Not unless a pharmaceutical company breaks the rules will we have a vaccine before November. That's it, period. Because there's multiple stages that a vaccine has to go through. And there's 2 vaccines right now that are in the midst of clinical trials. And each one of those phases in the clinical trials, I think there's 3 main phases here in the US. And I think that's true worldwide. As I think World Health Organization, was reporting this the other day, that many of these phases in which you have humans as the subjects in these clinical trials can last a year to 18 months, because you have to figure out what all the side effects are. And any television commercial you see of a pharmaceutical drug, they've got 30 seconds worth of benefits about the drug, and then they've got 30 seconds worth of side benefits. Don't, be aware of all this. So I don't think we're going to see a vaccine before sometime next year, which means, right, we've got to deal with this thing all during fall season. Now, I talked about housing. Let me go back here for a second. Existing home sales, I said, was increasing, and you can see it in the permits data. This is Canadian permits for non-residential facilities are in the dark blue here. Multifamily, condos, apartment buildings, et cetera, is in the red. And you can see by region, and then single family is in the gray. So in all the major regions where people live across Canada, all of them except Quebec and British Columbia, have a positive change in the value of those building permits. So you can see where the growth is occurring most within Canada, and then for the country as a whole, you can see that most of the growth has been in non-residential and single-family units, and then apartments and condominiums, et cetera, are still dragging there in terms of the housing market. Now, so your equity markets, one of the things that I always say is that the stock market is not an indicator of economic performance. And we see the administration here in the U.S. talk about this all the time. Look how great the economy is. The stock market's way up. Well, that's a misnomer. You do not equate economic performance with stock market performance. The stock market responds based off of expectations. And those expectations can be forged by erroneous media broadcasts, right? And so, or people misinterpreting the data. Go all the way back here to GDP, right? People see this minus 41%, unless they know that that's an annualized number, they may think that things are more dire than what they are. So you got to be careful with the data, right? But if you look at the S&P and TSX index, you compare between the two countries, and that index that's compared, that is going up. So at least expectations are going up similarly. Now, if you look at the income, the reason I put income in here is because people can't spend money on flowers, shrubs, trees, landscape services unless they've got money. And because if you look at all the measures, now these are not all of them, because I'm telling you, in the Canadian relief, and I haven't talked to any Canadians about this, but this is from an outsider perspective. If you look at the CARES Act here in the US, and you look at some of the relief packages that you have passed there in Canada, I've been very envious of the breadth, not necessarily the depth, but at least the breadth. You've tried not to leave any behind in terms of your relief packages. Now, of course, CURB, the Canadian Emergency Relief Benefit, has been one of the biggest pieces of your relief package. And the question now is whether CRB, is causing a displacement of workers. Remember the 1.1 workers that the jobs haven't gone back? Some of those are people who, because of the Canadian Emergency Relief Benefit, if they're a lower income worker, they've elected to stay home because they can earn more by staying home than they could on the job. Now, many people think that that's a big number. I'm here to tell you that in the States, even though it occurs, it's not a big number. All right. So again, you can look at the total package of your benefits, and you've generated $21 billion in terms of benefits, but you're still down in terms of what people, their wealth that they had, the difference between 44 and 21, right? You're still down about $20 billion there. All right, so let's move on to spending, because this is where it gets a little more optimistic. You can see that consumers, year-over-year change in debit and credit card spending, that their spending has been trending upward, right? So that's a good sign. You can see the data for August, where people's increase in spending has gone up right there. So that, again, that's a very good signal that people are feeling confident enough to spend their money. All right, so let me just take a quick break right there. People are feeling confident enough to spend their money. Let's let that sink in a little bit, because that's good news. Here in the States, consumption by consumers represents 68 to 70% of GDP in any given year. And of course, the other major factors of GDP are business expenditures, and then government expenditures, and then the balance between imports and exports. But as you well know, the trade wars that our president has started have impacted the U.S. dramatically, and because the U.S. Mexican Canadian agreement is still being forged, right? There's still some uncertainty, and that uncertainty has affected business expectations, and it's affected business investment. So one piece of that GDP package, business investment, is missing. That's an important piece because we get 4-to-1 returns, you know, 1, 2, 3, 4. You know, we get, if I'm down here in Texas, I say 1, 2, 3, 4, but I say 1, 2, 3, 4. The 4-to-1 return for every dollar that's spent by all the Canadian businesses to the Canadian economy. Every dollar that you spend, I started to say you and I, but I'm not Canadian. I only want to be. So the crack myself up sometimes. Now, there's a 2-to-1 return for every dollar we spend as consumers. All right, so that's an important thing to remember. Now, let me also pause and say, remember, you can type in questions. I've been following the chat box, and either you're amazed by my brilliance or you're baffled by my ignorance. I don't know. So you can pop in questions there anytime in the chat box, and I'm monitoring that. So let me know if you got any questions. All right, back to previously planned programming. All right, let's look at population in Canada, right? Here's the boomers, right? We've got the boomers. You got people from 0 years of age, yet being born, all the way up to, people with more experience, right? We won't say old people with more experience, right? And you got people between the ages of 54 and 75, this is the baby boomer segment, and baby boomers built our industry, as I've said before. You've heard me talk about that. And right now you got 37.56. So this number here is a slightly outdated, 37.56 million people across Canada. You have about a 1.2% growth rate. That is not sustaining of any country's economy. Right? You need a higher growth rate. Y'all need to get busy and making more people. So you need more, because if you look past here, there's again, boomers, they put us on the map. They bought a lot of flower, shrubs, and trees. And post-World War II, the housing boom, both in the US and Canada, people buying and selling houses, they need flower, shrubs, and trees around those houses. They need landscape services. So I'm very bullish about the landscape. You landscapers that are online, mathematically, if you look at these baby boomers and they're aging, they're going to be doing less of their landscape services themselves. They're going to be wanting somebody to do those landscape services for them. So I'm very bullish on the landscape sector right here because of these demographic shifts. But look, back behind those, you had those Gen Xers. There's a whole lot fewer people. And then you got the millennials down here. That's the next big wave. But look behind the millennials. You got Gen Zs. So while the math works for us in terms of our market size currently over the next decade, you can see that we have a little bit of lull there, and people garden landscape most between the ages of 35 and 65, right? And really the hot spot's 45 to 65. And you can see we got a lot of people in that category up here, fewer people when you get down to here. So we're going to have to do some people making, or we're going to have to get people to consume more. All right. Either we penetrate the market among more people, or we further, we get people that are existing customers to buy more from us. That's what I'm trying to say. All right, so remember my recession forecast last year, and it was just in January. I was talking to another Canadian group that I said there's 25% chance of recession in 2019, I said last year, and 50% chance of recession in 2020 and 80% chance in 21. I wasn't expecting recession in US or Canada until late 2021, probably. I say late versus early, but 2021, right? So obviously, the other thing I said, this is another slide that I pulled back. I also said that what could cause that forecast to go awry was monetary policy. If the Federal Reserve, or if I forget the entity in Canada, right? I'm having a senior moment, but if you the Royal Bank of Canada and National Bank of Canada, it was started doling out money as fast as they could go. You know, interest rates manipulated to even go negative. Maybe some of that monetary policy would go awry. Trade war effects, OPEC, I said, but reneging on their output deal. And that's why oil prices are so bad right now, is because Russia reneged on the output deal that Saudi and the rest of OPEC had with Russia. And so Saudi Arabia said, we're done being the buffer in the world market. So we're going to keep piling our oil in the market. And so the price went down, right? And they were just trying to teach Russia a lesson. But it's taught U.S. and Canada that we got the side effects from that. You know, it's like the fallout from the hurricane. We said a bubble could be bursting. You know, I had a lot of trepidation about housing there in Canada, and that whether that was going to be a bubble that was going to be bursting because of the prices in Canada in certain regions, and recession in China and Europe, and our trade with China and Europe, and that if it was big enough that it could have an impact on the Canadian economy. And I said black swan events, but I said you can't predict those, so we can't worry about those. Well, guess what? We had a black swan event, and we had a big one, all right? And so at the time, I was worried about the Mexican, Canadian, U.S. trade agreement. I was worried about housing because there have been some programs put forth in Canada to put people in houses and to promote growth within the housing industry. And I was worrying about whether you were borrowing too much activity from the future, whether you're enticing people to build houses now, but then you were going to pay the piper later because they wouldn't need a house later. So that's was my concern, particularly how correlated that was to single family housing prices. And then I was, you know, you've been monkeying with the interest rates, and you had a interest rate hike at that time last year. You had some minimum wage increases. You had new mortgage rules. And I wasn't sure how that was going to play out in terms of inflation and the job growth within Canada. The good news is that it's been held roughly in check. And then, of course, the current debt service levels by households in Canada was the highest it had been in many years. So those were the things I was concerned about. And then COVID hits. It's like, what the crap? This is piling on. So this is not fair. So there's been a lot of changes, and a lot of changes in the green industry. And so that's where I want to shift. I want to look at my time. I'm talking a lot more than I thought I was going to. Let me go through these data first, the green industry. Here in the US, there were about 2/3 of the growers whose sales were either static or up from 2019. Only about 1/3 were down. They're down 1 to 10%, 11 to 25, down more than 25%. As of June 10th, all right, I took this data through June 10th. These are growers, right? These are growers that are in my Eagle network. I teach an executive education program for nursery and greenhouse growers. These are growers, about 100 that are in my Eagle network. You can see a bunch of folks, their sales were up. You saw it on the retailers that are part of my benchmarking efforts called Your Market Metrics. Retail IGCs, their gross sales were up 18%. Their gross margin dollars were up 19%. That's a pretty darn good year considering everybody felt Armageddon was coming in March and in April. And yet the recovery from a green industry standpoint, people staying at home more, has been good. Other data that my friend Danny Summers, who has a garden center group, peer group, you can see across the US, you can see these growth rates that are year over year. Sales in 2020 compared to the same date last year, right? So a lot of folks up from 25 to 41%. Those that I've talked to in Canada, same thing. You've had a really good year, or most people had a really good year. The ones here in the States that didn't have a good year were in states where they were not allowed to operate. They weren't deemed to be essential, which really chaps my hide in terms of that word, because as you've heard me say many, many times, because of the health and well-being benefits of flowers, shrubs, and trees and landscape services, and how we enhance the quality of people's lives. I mean, this was a health crisis, for goodness sake. And I wrote 4 journal articles last year on the health and well-being benefits of flowers, shrubs, and trees. So it just made me mad whenever they said that, nope, Mr. Landscaper, you can't open, you're not essential. Mr. Garden Center operator, you're not essential. Miss Florist, you're not essential. Oh man, it just really chopped my hide. The question is, are we going to see that same trend in 2021? Well, some of the data that I've got here, just the flower seeds and potted plants, because that's the GDP data I have access to. I don't have shrubs and trees because they're incorporated in the residential investment numbers. But you can see in the first year of most recessions, we see an increase, just like we did in 2020. But in the second year, when people start switching expenditures to durable goods, cars, houses, refrigerators, clothing, furniture and so forth. When they start buying durable goods, we usually take a hit in the second year, or when the recovery begins and people are buying those durable goods, they buy fewer flowers, shrubs, and trees and landscape services. So that's what I'm concerned about. Are we going to be as optimistic in 2021 as what we are now? What does the post-COVID green industry look like? I still think there's an undersupply of houses and pent-up demand there in Canada. COVID has made it definitely a pent-up demand situation. I think there's going to be continued strain on the energy sector and the petroleum sector there in Canada. I think you're going to see a lot of business closures. I think there's some that won't make it through this crisis. And I think there's going to be some constraints on our supply chains. We've seen that worldwide, US, Canada, Mexico, and the rest of the world. I think we're going to see more adoption of B2B and B2C technologies. If anything, COVID taught us that we can't rely on face-to-face all the time, so we got to implement some of those technologies. Things like shrink, labor, working capital, those are still critical key success factors. Everything I've said about those in the past still holds true. You can't ignore them. And there's going to be higher operating costs from worker safety requirements, provision of protection equipment, and the social distancing that we have to do. That increases our cost of operating. And healthcare premiums and so forth are likely to increase, at least here in the States. You have a much different situation there in Canada. So I had this slide at the last slide last time where I said, you got to be prepared for the downturn. And well, the downturn's here. I said you should have already had these in place where you are leveraged properly. There's working capital that you can manage the cash flow. That is, you got to defer CapEx, defer any sort of maintenance on your operation. For goodness sake, the dividends are out the window. You delay the tax dates if you can, ask for extensions, pay suppliers within terms, make full use of your line of credit, and substitute short-term debt or transfer some of that short-term debt to long-term debt. Again, affect those interest rates. And then make sure you're operating lean and efficiently, and that you have a value proposition that you put forth where people see your essentiality. People understand what you're standing for, right? They understand the things that the reason why they should buy flowers, shrubs, and trees and landscape services. All right. Lastly, I do want to remind you of the 2021 Garden Center Summit that's there in Canada. It's going to be in Edmonton. Corey Bordine, a good buddy of mine, is going to be the keynote speaker. He's going to be outstanding. That's July 5 through 7. And I sure hope that you do that in person, right? Versus not being in person. So let me stop the PowerPoint. I know that there's been some other questions that have come in. The thing is, what availability issues will impact the supply lines for garden centers and plant product? All right, good question. I'm already hearing of shortages of shrubs and trees, not bedding plants, not necessarily on perennials, but on shrubs and trees. And some of the data I was referring to in garden centers earlier, if you look at the GMROI, gross margin return on inventory, the performance in all categories has been positive this year. 20% or more increases in gross margin. So that's good. Now, in terms of availability, what I'm seeing on the young plant side is that people are buying everything that a young plant grower has right now. That tells me that there are some growers that are ramping up production. And I'm a little worried about that because anytime, Robin, we see the industry respond to a downturn, we tend to overcompensate. Whenever there's shortages of plants that are in the pipeline, growers tend to overcompensate, and it's not but at 18, 24 months, we find a glut on the market or a surplus of plants. And so that's what I'm keeping my eye on right now.
Yes, yeah, you're right. That's what the biggest concern of how much to grow for next year, how much to buy for next year.
Yeah, and if I was in your shoes, I would plan for a modest increase, but I wouldn't be looking at those year-over-year increases, 2020 over 2019, and saying, okay, we were up 25% or 40% this year. We're going to plan for a 40% next year. I don't think it's going to happen like that. So you need to take 2018, 2019, 2020, and maybe average those and then maybe back off 2 or 3% from that. So I'd be very conservative in terms of my growth plan for next year because of that second year effect that when we come out of a downturn and people start buying durable goods. So I wouldn't, if you had a 40% increase in volume this year, I wouldn't necessarily anticipate that to be the case next year. So, what sort of distribution challenges? Let me talk about that for a second. The supply chain has definitely changed. And so one of the things that I'm looking at is the lead time that it takes to get products from whenever you're ordering from a manufacturer distributor. Here in the States and in Canada, you're seeing delays, at least in most surveys that I've seen by the Institute of Supply Manufacturers, ISM we call them. Most surveys, and the latest one was in the last of July, 40% of the folks were saying that there's longer lead times in Canada and like 30% in Mexico and roughly a similar percentage in the US. So you got 40% of the customers saying that there's longer lead times between you have to order products sooner in order to get it in the same amount of same time. If you need it to here, you better order it 2 weeks earlier than what you did, in other words. So that's lead times. Here in the States, we have right now manufacturing capacity at we're at 74% of normal. And I couldn't really calculate or find that number for Canada. But I get a sense looking at the manufacturing data that you're in a similar situation, that you're about 3/4 of where you normally are in terms of your manufacturing capacity. And that's only because of June and July data were pretty good. So that's, had you not had as good a June and July data, I wouldn't be so optimistic there. Tanya said in Ontario, we're waiting 6 to 8 weeks for truckloads of bagged soils and case goods of fertilizer. Absolutely. So you gotta plan that in your normal procurement and purchasing practices. You have to plan for that lead time to be increased. The other aspect is labor. That many firms, I say many because I can't remember the exact percentage. I think it's 69% said that they have not hired back all the employees that they let go during COVID. And there's about a quarter of them who are saying that they are not going to hire back some of their employees from after COVID. All right. So we may see from availability of labor standpoint, we actually may see a few more, or the labor availability work out in our favor, particularly from the construction industry. Will your housing statistics translate into different demand on landscape services in different provinces? Yes. In fact, if I was looking at the growth rates of landscaping services and trying to project that, I'd look at the growth rate in your respective province, and I would plan or develop my model, my forecasting model appropriately. So there's some areas, and I showed you the areas where the single family housing was going to be increasing, because we know the permits data, that first you got the permit, then you've got a new home data, and then you have existing home data. Only the difference between existing home and new home data is existing home has been closed on, and a new home there's a contract on. So you got all those housing indicators. All of those indicators for Canada are looking well in certain provinces better than others, right? So I think Jeff, I'm looking at your question. I think I'm interpreting that right, where your housing is translating to different demand. Yes, I do, because there's certain areas within Canada in which the housing market's going to be stronger, right? So I would take those projections into consideration. What else, Robin?
Well, one thing I wanted to ask you about, like you touched on a lot of things in your seminar. One of them I want to go back to. One was, you're right, the CERB, we call in Canada the CERB, the Canadian Emergency Relief Fund or benefit or whatever. So we are having a hard time getting employees. That's the big thing right now. The other thing I wanted to talk to you about was, did you find, we found that we were all told to stay home. And what I always say to everybody stayed home, decided to garden. We had parents, I think, we had this huge influx of nothing to do with their kids, people coming in and wanting to start gardening from the ground up, teaching their kids, starting gardens. The food security thing came up. Some people went from selling 300 pounds of seed potato to 2,500 pounds of seed potato. You had this whole transition of the new gardener kind of happening. And at the same time, you had, in Canada, we have cannabis. Cannabis sales went through the roof. People wanted to try growing their own cannabis. So did you see that in other markets of maybe the potential of bringing the new gardener in, all these new people coming in that they had all this time on their hand, they thought they'd try gardening. You think that's going to continue the trend? Is this the start of a new hobby maybe for the future generations?
That's such a great question. And we saw the very same phenomena we saw here in the States as well. And in fact, much of the added volume, so I talked about the gross sales increasing. What I didn't talk about is that average transaction count went up and the number of transactions went up, right? The dollar sale per transaction and the transaction count, both of those went up. Of the transaction count that went up, it varies by retailer that I talk with, but generally they say a third of the customers were new customers that they had never seen in the store before. To me, that says, okay, people are recognizing, finally they're reading all the stuff that's in the gardening magazines. Finally, they're reading the articles that are in the newspaper that talk about the benefits of plants, and they're at home anyway. And if we can get the kids outside for a little bit rather than on their Game Boy or whatever, and we just get them outside doing something. And one of the doing somethings was, of course, gardening or landscaping, planting a tree or putting in seed potatoes or tomatoes or what have you. Now, in the past, if history is prologue, we will only get a small portion of those that will remain customers when the economy recovers, right? We have not had 100% retention of all those new customers in the past. So what best we can hope for, I think, is probably 30 to 40% of those new customers will come back again next year. I have no data in which to back that up. It's only been my anecdotal conversations with garden center operators that in both pre-recession, during the recession, and after recession, And this is, I'm talking about mostly from the Great Recession and what conversations I've had this year. So all I can do is say history is prologue and say that, the past is the best predictor of the future. And so if we can get 30 to 40% of those new ones to come back again, because some of them weren't successful. Some of them got outside and they tried those things and said, crap, this is a lot of work. and they're not likely to do that again. However, some we captured. And if we can, like I said, if we can get 30 to 40% of those back, hopefully most of the garden center operators kept lists, right? Of list of all these new customers, and you got them in your contact list now. And you need to emphasize not just the fact that there's the possibility of growing food, local, safe food in your backyard, not just emphasize the fact that you can beautify your yard, not just to emphasize the latest varieties, but to emphasize the health and well-being benefits, because this is a health crisis. We need to tell people, if you've got a kid with ADHD, 20 minutes in the landscape that you put in has the same effect as 2 of their medications, has the same effect neurologically. And the same way with seniors and with, so you got kids, benefits for seniors. And if you're not aware of those benefits, on my website, you can just Google Charlie Hall, Ellison Share. It's the first thing that pops up. It's search engine optimization. And so you go on my website, there's a benefits of plants button. You click there and I have everything in red where you should click to emphasize plant benefits.
Perfect. One other thing Dr. Hall was going to bring up was kind of an anomaly this year in garden centers. There was such a high demand of all our products from the independent garden center. And one thing was, what's interesting, and we had this conversation across Canada, no one was putting anything on sale. No one was advertising. They were selling out. They were getting full margin for all their product. And we didn't have to advertise. I mean, it's not good for the advertising industry, but it was very interesting to see that our margins were phenomenal and we didn't have to pay to get sales.
Yeah.
Was that the same across in the United States?
It was. And again, it was the antithesis of the perfect storm, because usually we're having to either battle the weather or the economy or both. And now we were battling the economy, but people were still looking to spend in a certain portion of their income. But we had good weather for the most part. We had plenty of good quality product. And so a lot of good things were happening for us this year. Again, we shouldn't plan for all of those good things to keep happening next year, particularly if there's a second wave of COVID that comes in the fall. And we'll see how that plays out. Now, Tanya was asking on here about tropicals, and Ann also talked about that from indoor plants. Is that trend going to continue? I really do, because the demand from Gen Z and millennials for succulents and indoor plants has been very strong. And I teach a class of 336 students, and I give them free plants. And oftentimes I give them a succulent or a foliage plant or a little 4-inch mum. You thought I paid their tuition. They get so excited about that little plant. And so I do see that trend continuing, and I see that firsthand. How do you suggest we look at advertising budgets for fall 20 and spring 21? Great question. Normally, I would say 3 to 5% of your gross sales should be tied to marketing. That's the general marketing rule of thumb. That's been for green industry businesses and non-green industry businesses. There are very few, very, 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 very few green industry businesses, grower, landscaper, service provider, or a retailer, that spend 3 to 5% of gross sales. Put it this way: when nobody else, one of the first things that companies is marketing. And if nobody else is marketing, imagine if you're the only megaphone in a room, everybody hears you, right? So I don't think that it's time to curb all of your marketing budgets. Yeah, you can be conservative, but you want to do some marketing and particularly in terms of, I think some of these health and well-being benefits be outstanding for that.
Perfect.
Okay, I'm looking through here. Robin, did I miss anything?
No, you look like we got 1 minute left. I think the biggest thing, you got to be careful how you say this, but, relatively, COVID's been pretty good to independent garden centers in our industry. And it's,
Yeah.
whether you feel kind of shamed to say that, but it's interesting how I think how the garden centers reacted really quickly. I think people felt comfortable going there because they reacted quickly. You could shop outdoors, which is nice, especially in the May and June months.
Yeah.
So, and people, like one customer said one time, this is my sanctuary during this time, whether you have music playing, walk around the nursery, get ideas. It's my place to get away. And so I think you're right. Mental health is a big part of it. We had some great articles in Canada about that, well-being. And I think it's all part of the package, whether it's food security, whether it's mental health or outdoor exercise or education for your kids. There's a lot of moving parts here for our industry and that we can take advantage of. So I'm glad it was great across the country. I know every province and every state was a little different. But the biggest question I think people are worried about is going forward, and with your help and your slideshow, I hope we can help make the decision of what's going to happen in a year. Maybe 2021 will not be good weather, like we had great weather. Maybe we won't, maybe we don't have to buy as much, but maybe be prepared to, look at the numbers and what we're going to grow and what we're going to buy. So that's a lot of great information you gave us. I'm glad we all can take it home and absorb it. Your slideshow is available and we'll make it available to everybody. I don't know if you have any parting words, Dr. Hall, but we really appreciate you coming on again. This is a short, condensed version, 1 hour, and not a lot of question and answer. It's not like the perfect, but hopefully we can maybe come back to this in Edmonton when we have you there for our next summit.
Yeah, absolutely. Because there's a lot of questions I'd be answering at the breaks or at dinner time or whatever if you're there meeting face to face that you can't do here. But let me just close with this: is that all right? I tend to look at any sort of downturn. I'm an optimistic economist by nature, and I know that's an oxymoron, right? I know that. People have called me Professor Silver Lining. However, I really am bullish on our market. It's just that we have to plan conservatively and not be overly aggressive, because we could have the perfect storm next year rather than the perfect, the antithesis. I got to come up with some other word to counter to a perfect storm. But instead of perfect conditions, we could have something go wrong, as you said. However, again, I am very bullish on our industry, and just because the math doesn't work for us in the 10 years from now, I think we have an opportunity to position ourselves so that we will be very strong in the future. Thanks. Yeah. Hey, Ann.
Hey, I have a quick question that just came across. Do you have any idea what you think Christmas sales are going to look like? Where do you think people's heads are at for Christmas?
Yeah, I think Christmas sales are going to be roughly strong, unless we get unless there's a horrendous second wave that occurs before Christmas. I think people are going to be wanting to celebrate. They're going to be indoors anyway. And I don't think Christmas sales are going to be hindered because of this. I think they'll be not hindered, but they'll be propelled because of that. I think there's going to be folks that want to make Christmas special because it's been such a tough year otherwise.
Yeah. Well,
So
great,
thanks
Dr.
again for the invitation. I appreciate that.
No, thank you. It's been great.
Yeah.
And thank you to everyone attending. Again, I'll be sending out all of the information to you, both the slides as well as the recording. And I'll also send out the link to Dr. Hall's website, which he referred to.
Perfect.
You,
great to see you again, Dr. Hall.
All righty.
We'll
take care. All right.
In the
Dr.
prairies.
Hall, cheers.
Not in the mountains of the prairies.
Yeah.
Ann, are you there?
Okay, just wait till all the participants head out.